The morning sun beat down on Naval Station Coronado with the kind of relentless heat that made even the palm trees seem to wilt. Brennan Castellanos pushed through the glass doors of Building 47, her canvas work bag slung over one shoulder, the familiar weight of her laptop and files pressing against her ribs. The air conditioning hit her like a wall, raising goosebumps along her forearms despite the long sleeves of her button-down shirt. She'd worn long sleeves every day for the past 4 years, even when the San Diego summer turned the logistics office into a greenhouse before the AC kicked in. The morning briefing room hummed with voices. Junior officers clustered near the coffee station, their crisp Navy working uniforms still creased from fresh laundering. Brennan slipped into her usual seat in the back row, the metal chair scraping against the linoleum with a sound that made her shoulders tense. She set her bag down carefully, methodically, the way she did everything now. Trent Voss stood at the front of the room, his khaki uniform stretched tight across shoulders that spoke of too many hours in the base gym and not enough time doing anything useful. He was a lieutenant junior grade, 3 years into his career, and he carried himself like someone who believed his rank meant something beyond the bars on his collar. His eyes swept the room and landed on Brennan with that familiar look, the one that mixed contempt with something worse. Amusement. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've witnessed similar acts of courage where you're from. He leaned toward Corinna Wade, the civilian contractor who handled personnel files. Corinna had started at the base 6 months ago and had latched on a Trent circle like a barnacle on a ship's hull. She laughed at whatever he whispered, her eyes flicking toward Brennan with that same practiced dismissiveness. The briefing began with Commander Hayes going over the week's logistics schedule. Brennan took notes in her precise handwriting, tracking supply chain updates and facility maintenance requests. She'd been working in base operations for 2 years now, ever since she'd left active duty, and she knew the systems better than most of the officers who thought their rank gave them expertise. But she never spoke up in meetings unless directly asked. She kept her head down, did her job, and tried to make it through each day without incident. Trent's voice cut through the commander's presentation. "He's requesting clarification on a supply order," he said, but Brennan caught the edge in his tone. She'd heard it before, that particular quality that meant he was about to make someone's day harder. The commander answered patiently, then moved on. As the briefing ended and people filed out, Brennan gathered her things slowly. She'd learned to time her exits, to avoid the crush of bodies in the doorway, the accidental bumps and touches that made her skin crawl. But Trent was faster. He positioned himself near her row, close enough that she had to pass him. "Nice shirt, Castellanos," he said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "You know, they make short sleeves now. Technology's really advanced." Corinna laughed, high and sharp. Maybe she thinks long sleeves look more official. More military. Brennan kept her expression neutral, her hands steady as she adjusted her bag strap. She'd learned not to react, not to give them anything to work with. She moved past them without a word, her footsteps measured and quiet against the floor. The hallway stretched ahead, fluorescent lights humming overhead. She could hear their voices behind her, not quite whispering, not quite loud enough for her to call them out on it. Something about civilians trying too hard, about people who wanted credit without putting in the work. The words were familiar now, worn smooth by repetition. Her office was a small cube in the corner of the operations wing, shared with 2 other logistics coordinators who rarely showed up before 10. Brennan preferred the quiet morning hours. The time before the base came fully alive with the noise and chaos of 1,000 personnel going about their duties. She set her bag on the desk and powered up her computer, the screen casting a pale glow across her workspace. The day's task list was long. Purchase orders to review, facility requests to prioritize, coordination with the supply depot across the bay. She dove into the work with the kind of focus that had always been her strength, the ability to shut out everything else and concentrate on the mission at hand. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency, pulling up spreadsheets and databases, cross-referencing inventory against projected needs. But even as she worked, She was aware of her sleeves against her skin, the fabric covering what no one here could see, what no one here would ever understand. The afternoon briefing was mandatory for all operations staff, which meant Brennan couldn't avoid it. She arrived exactly on time, not early enough to draw attention, but not late enough to have every eye on her as she entered. The conference room was bigger than the morning space, with windows that looked out over the tarmac where helicopters sat in neat rows, their rotors still in the heat. Trent had claimed a seat at the main table, right in the center where everyone could see him. Corinna sat 2 chairs down, her tablet open in front of her, stylus poised like she was about to take the most important notes of her career. 3 other junior officers flanked them, all wearing that same expression of casual confidence that came from never having had to prove themselves in any way that mattered. Brennan took a seat along the wall, in the second row of chairs reserved for civilian staff and lower-ranking personnel. She preferred the peripheral view, the ability to observe without being the focus of observation. Commander Hayes entered with Captain Moreno, the base operations officer, and everyone straightened slightly in their seats. The meeting covered the upcoming visit from Admiral Sutherland, a 3-star who was making rounds to West Coast installations. He'd be conducting a ceremony on Friday to recognize outstanding service members and civilians who'd contributed to base operations over the past year. It was a routine visit, the kind of thing that happened a dozen times annually, but it meant extra work for everyone in the logistics chain. Captain Moreno went through the requirements: enhanced security protocols, facility preparations, coordination with the Admiral staff for timing and venue setup. Brennan made notes in her leather-bound notebook, her handwriting small and precise. She'd need to coordinate with facilities management, arrange for additional seating, confirm the sound system was operational. That's when Trent raised his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying that edge of false deference that officers learned in their first leadership course. "I'm wondering about the attendee list for the ceremony. Will it be limited to active duty personnel and verified veterans, or are we including all base employees?" Captain Moreno's brow furrowed slightly. "All base employees who've been nominated or who play a key role in operations are invited, Lieutenant." "Why do you ask?" Trent leaned back in his chair, his shoulders loose and relaxed in a way that made Brennan's own shoulders tighten. "Just thinking about the optics, sir. The Admiral is here to honor service and sacrifice. Want to make sure we're presenting the right image." "The right image," Corinna echoed, nodding like Trent had just solved a complex equation. "It's important for ceremony integrity." Commander Hayes cut in, her voice sharp. "Every civilian on this base contributes to our mission. The Admiral understands that." Next item. But the damage was done. Brennan could feel the shift in the room, the way several sets of eyes had found her along the wall. She kept her gaze on her notebook, her pen still moving across the page, even though she was no longer processing the words being spoken at the front of the room. After the meeting, people clustered in small groups, discussing assignments and responsibilities. Brennan moved toward the door, her path calculated to avoid the main congregation, but Trent's voice stopped her. "Hey, Castellanos, you'll be at the ceremony, right? Since you're in operations?" She turned slowly, her face carefully neutral. "If I'm assigned to support it, yes." He smiled, and there was nothing friendly in it. "Just curious how that works. You know, standing there with people who've actually deployed, actually put on the uniform. Must be interesting being surrounded by real service members." Corinna stepped closer, her arms crossed over her chest. "I've been meaning to ask, Brennan, did you ever serve? Like actually serve? Because I've never heard you mention it." Brennan's hand tightened on her notebook, the leather warm under her palm. "That's because I don't talk about it," she said quietly. Trent laughed, short and dismissive. Classic response. If someone really served, really saw combat, they'd have stories. They'd have that look, you know? You just look like someone who processes paperwork. One of the other junior officers, a lieutenant named Marcus Pruitt, shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, Voss. Leave it alone." But Trent was enjoying himself now, feeding off Corinna's eager attention and the small audience that had gathered. "I'm not saying there's anything wrong with being a civilian," he continued. "It's honest work. But let's not pretend it's the same thing as putting your life on the line. That's all I'm saying. Brennan met his eyes for just a moment, and something in her gaze made him blink. Then she turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she left them behind. Back in her office, she sat at her desk and stared at her computer screen without seeing it. Her hands were shaking, so she pressed them flat against the desk until they stilled. She'd dealt with worse than Trent Voss. She'd dealt with things that would have broken him in half. But that didn't make it easier. It just made it different. The afternoon sun slanted through her window, casting long shadows across the floor. In 3 days, Admiral Sutherland would arrive. In 3 days, there would be a ceremony. And Brennan would be there, in the background where she belonged, doing her job and staying invisible. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of coastal fog that made everything feel muted and distant. Brennan stood in her small apartment kitchen, coffee mug warming her hands, staring out at the gray sky without really seeing it. She'd slept poorly, the way she often did when stress compounded with memory. Her mind had spent the night replaying moments she'd spent years trying to forget, triggered by Trent's mocking voice asking if she had that look. She knew what looking meant. The 1,000-yard stare they talked about in training videos, the hypervigilance that made veterans scan every room for exits, the way some people flinched at loud noises or couldn't stand having their backs to doors. Brennan had learned to control those responses, to mask them so thoroughly that no one could see the constant calculation running beneath her calm exterior. The coffee was too hot, but she drank it anyway, welcoming the sharp sensation that pulled her fully into the present moment. She set the mug in the sink and moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision. Shower at exactly 6:15. Dress in clothes she'd laid out the night before. Long sleeves, always long sleeves, in a lightweight cotton that wouldn't make her overheat but would cover everything that needed covering. In the mirror, she looked like exactly what Trent thought she was. A civilian employee, unremarkable and soft, someone who'd never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult spreadsheet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. No makeup beyond basic professionalism. Nothing that drew attention. That was the point. That had been the point for 4 years now. The drive to base took 20 minutes through morning traffic. She showed her ID at the gate, received the same polite nod from the security personnel she got every day, and parked in her assigned spot near Building 47. The fog was already burning off, the sun breaking through in shafts of light that made the pavement shimmer. Inside, the operations office buzzed with activity. The Admiral's visit was only 2 days away now, and everyone was feeling the pressure of preparation. Brennan dove into her task list, coordinating with the facilities team about seating arrangements, confirming audiovisual equipment, double-checking the ceremony schedule against the Admiral's staff requirements. She was deep in an email exchange with the protocol office when a sound made her freeze. Someone had dropped something metal in the hallway, and the clang echoed through the building with sharp percussion. For a moment, just a moment, Brennan wasn't in her office anymore. She was somewhere else, somewhere hot and loud and filled with smoke, where metal sounds meant incoming fire and you had 3 seconds to move before everything went wrong. Her hand had gone to her ribs, fingers pressing against fabric and the ridges of scar tissue underneath. She caught herself, forced her hand back to the keyboard, made her breathing even out. No one had noticed. Her office mates weren't at their desks yet. She was alone with the reaction, and she could control it, push it down, lock it away where it belonged. The morning passed in a blur of logistics coordination. She approved purchase orders, routed facility requests, and managed the dozens of small details that would make the ceremony run smoothly. It was good work, important work, even if people like Trent couldn't see it. Every ceremony, every recognition event, every official function required hundreds of hours of behind-the-scenes coordination. Brennan was good at it because she understood mission planning, resource allocation, and the critical importance of backup plans. At lunch, she ate at her desk, a salad from the commissary, eaten mechanically while she reviewed the protocol requirements one more time. The Admiral would arrive at 1300 hours on Friday. There would be a brief tour of key facilities, then the ceremony at 1500 hours in the main assembly hall. Brennan would be there early, ensuring everything was in place, troubleshooting any last-minute issues. Her phone buzzed with a text from Commander Hayes. "Need you in conference room B at 1400. Pre-ceremony coordination meeting." Brennan acknowledged the message and returned to her work. 2 hours later, she walked into conference room B to find it already full. Trent was there, of course, along with Corinna and several other officers involved in the ceremony planning. Commander Hayes stood at the head of the table, a projected schedule on the screen behind her. The meeting covered the final details: security checkpoints, arrival protocol, seating assignments, the order of recognition for outstanding performers. Brennan provided updates on facility readiness and equipment status, her voice steady and professional. She'd given hundreds of briefings during her active duty years. This was no different, except for the way Trent watched her with that calculating expression. When the meeting ended, most people filed out quickly, eager to return to their desks and the mountain of work waiting there. Brennan gathered her materials slowly, letting the room empty. But Trent lingered, and Corinna with him. "Castellanos," Trent said, leaning against the conference table with studied casualness. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about not talking about your service." Brennan didn't look up from her notebook. "I need to get back to my office, Lieutenant." "See, that's the thing," he continued, ignoring her attempt to leave. "People who really served, they have verification. Records, unit assignments, deployment dates. It's all documented. So I'm just curious what unit you were with when you deployed. Basic stuff." Brennan finally met his eyes, and her voice was very quiet when she spoke. "I don't know you my service record, Lieutenant Voss, and I have work to do." She walked past him toward the door, but his final words followed her into the hallway. "Just seems suspicious, that's all. People who have nothing to hide usually don't mind answering simple questions." Thursday morning brought with it the final push before the Admiral's arrival. Brennan was at her desk by 0630, running through her checklist one more time. Every detail had been confirmed, every contingency planned for, but she went through it all again anyway. That was how you kept people alive. That was how you made sure missions succeeded. Triple-check everything, assume nothing, and always have a backup plan. Commander Hayes had assigned her to work directly with Trent's team for the day, coordinating the final ceremony preparations. It was a logical assignment from a staffing perspective. Brennan had the institutional knowledge and attention to detail. Trent had the officers who would serve as ceremonial escorts and aides. Together, they were supposed to ensure everything ran perfectly. The reality was far less efficient. They met in the assembly hall at 0700, where the ceremony would take place the following afternoon. The space was cavernous, designed to hold 500 people for changeo of command ceremonies and official functions. Morning light streamed through high windows, illuminating rows of chairs that would need to be arranged precisely according to protocol requirements. Trent arrived with his usual entourage. Corinna carried a tablet and an expression of exaggerated importance. Lieutenant Pruitt looked tired, like he'd rather be anywhere else. Two enlisted personnel, petty officers who'd drawn the short straw for ceremony detail, stood ready to do the actual physical work. Brennan had her printed diagrams and floor plans, marked with measurements and positioning requirements. She approached Trent professionally, holding out the documents. "Here's the seating layout," she said. "The Admiral will enter from the east entrance, proceed down the center aisle, and take position on the stage. Flag officers and honor guests in the first 3 rows, base personnel behind them." Trent took the papers without really looking at them. "Yeah, we know how ceremonies work, Castellanos. Some of us have actually participated in them. As service members." Corinna smiled, sharp and cold. "Must be nice, just showing up at the clipboard while other people do the real work." Brennan ignored the comment and turned to the petty officers. "The chairs need to be in rows of 12 with 3-foot aisles. I'll mark the positions with tape if you want to start setting up." She moved to do exactly that, pulling painter's tape from her bag and measuring out the precise spacing. It was methodical work, requiring focus and accuracy. She'd done similar tasks 100 times before, though in very different contexts. Setting up field hospitals required the same attention to spatial planning, the same understanding that every foot of space mattered when lives were on the line. As she worked, Trent's voice carried across the hall. He was talking to Pruitt, but loud enough for everyone to hear. You know what's funny? Some people think that working around military personnel makes them military. Like proximity equals experience. Corinna laughed on cue. It's like stolen valor, but more pathetic. At least stolen valor people commit to the lie. The petty officers glanced at Brennan, then away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge their officers. Brennan kept working, her hand steady on the tape measure, her focus absolute. She learned a long time ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. Some enemies weren't worth engaging. You saved your energy for the moments that truly mattered. 2 hours later, the chairs were arranged, the sound system tested, and the stage prepared. Brennan checked items off her list with methodical precision. Trent spent most of that time on his phone, occasionally barking orders at the petty officers while contributing nothing of substance to the actual work. They moved to the next task, confirming the route from the Admiral's vehicle to the assembly hall. Security had already walked it, but protocol required a final verification by operations staff. Brennan led the group through the planned path, noting sight lines, potential bottlenecks, and emergency exit locations. It was basic advance work, the kind of thing she'd done dozens of times when preparing for VIP movements in far more dangerous environments. At one point, they passed a maintenance crew doing welding work on an exterior pipe. The sudden spark and hiss made Brennan stop mid-step, her body tensing before she could control it. Her hand moved instinctively toward her side, fingers seeking the weapon that hadn't been there for 4 years. She caught herself within a second, continued walking as if nothing had happened, but Trent had seen it. "Jumpy, aren't you?" he said, his voice falsely concerned. "That's interesting. Usually only people who've been in combat situations have that kind of startle response. But you wouldn't know anything about that, right?" Brennan didn't respond. She made a note on her clipboard about the maintenance work and its scheduled completion time, ensuring it wouldn't interfere with the Admiral's arrival. Professional, focused, unaffected, they returned to the assembly hall for a final walkthrough. Everything was perfect. The chairs aligned, the stage prepared, the audio system tested and operational. Brennan had done her job flawlessly, as she always did. But as she gathered her materials to leave, Corinna blocked her path. "I've been doing some research," Corinna said, her voice saccharine sweet. "Looking through base personnel records. Public information, you know. And it's interesting. Your file doesn't list any prior military service. Just hired as a civilian contractor 2 years ago." Trent moved closer, creating a loose circle around Brennan. "So here's my question. If you served, why isn't it in your file? Why no DD-214 on record? Why no unit history or deployment information?" Brennan looked at each of them in turn, her expression unreadable. "My employment file contains everything required for my position," she said quietly. "If you have questions about personnel records, take them to HR." She stepped around Corinna and walked toward the exit, her pace measured and controlled. Behind her, Trent's voice carried across the empty hall. "Tomorrow's going to be interesting. Real veterans standing next to people playing dress-up? Wonder if the Admiral will notice the difference." Brennan pushed through the doors into the bright sunlight, her breathing carefully controlled, her hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. One more day, just one more day, and the ceremony would be over. She could maintain control for one more day. She maintained it through far worse. Friday morning arrived with crystalline clarity, the kind of perfect San Diego weather that made recruitment posters look honest. Brennan stood in her apartment, staring at the clothes laid out on her bed. For the ceremony, she'd chosen a simple black dress, professional and respectful, with sleeves that reached her wrists. Over it, a lightweight blazer, conservative heels, a small American flag pin on her lapel, the only concession to military symbolism she allowed herself these days. She'd bought the pin 4 years ago at a gift shop near the VA hospital during one of her final follow-up appointments. It was subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice it, but it meant something to her. A quiet acknowledgement of service without the weight of explanation that came with more obvious displays. Her hands trembled slightly as she fastened the pin to her lapel, and she paused, pressing her palms flat against the dresser until the shaking stopped. She could do this. She'd faced far worse than a ceremony filled with people who questioned her credibility. She'd faced actual fire, actual blood, actual moments where death was 3 seconds away, and only her training and what kept her moving forward. The drive to base felt longer than usual, every traffic light holding her captive, every mile stretching out like she was moving through water. She arrived at 0900, 4 hours before the Admiral's scheduled arrival, because that's what you did when you ran logistics. You arrived early, you solved problems before they became crises, and you ensured mission success through preparation. The assembly hall was already bustling with activity. Security personnel walked their routes one final time. Audio-visual technicians adjusted microphone levels. The base photographer set up his equipment, testing angles and lighting. Brennan moved through it all with quiet efficiency, checking off items on her list, answering questions, solving the small problems that always emerged in the final hours before an important event. She was confirming the water station placement when Trent arrived, flanked by Corinna and 2 other junior officers. He wore his dress whites, the uniform crisp and bright, his ribbons and insignia gleaming in the overhead lights. He looked every inch the naval officer, confident and capable, the kind of person who'd never had to prove himself beyond showing up in the right uniform. He saw Brennan, and his expression shifted into something predatory. Well, Castellanos actually dressed up for once. That's almost like showing respect for the military. Corinna stepped closer, her eyes fixed on Brennan's lapel. Oh, cute. She's wearing a flag pin. That's adorable. Like a kid playing dress-up with their parents' medals. Brennan continued adjusting the water station placement, refusing to engage. She had work to do, and their opinion of her clothing choices wasn't part of her task list. But Trent wasn't finished. He moved directly into her path, forcing her to either stop or physically push past him. I want to talk about that pin, he said, his voice dropping to a tone that pretended at concern but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. See, there are rules about wearing military insignia and symbols. Regulations about who gets to display certain items. And I'm wondering if you understand those regulations. It's an American flag, Brennan said quietly. Available at any gift shop. Worn by millions of civilians every day. But context matters, Corinna interjected, pulling out her phone. The context of wearing it to a military ceremony, surrounded by actual service members, while you've consistently refused to provide any documentation of your own supposed service. That context makes it look like stolen valor. Brennan felt something cold settle in her chest. A familiar sensation she recognized from other moments when situations escalated beyond reasonable discourse into something darker. She looked at Trent, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd made her his project, his crusade, his opportunity to prove something to himself and others. I need to finish preparing for the ceremony, she said, her voice level and controlled. Excuse me. She stepped around him, but his hand shot out, not touching her, but blocking her path. His fingers came within inches of her shoulder, and Brennan reacted without thinking. She moved back sharply, her body shifting into a defensive posture that was pure muscle memory, pure training, pure instinct carved into her nervous system by experiences that had nothing to do with processing paperwork. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. Trent saw it, and something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or confirmation of something he'd suspected. He lowered his hand slowly, that predatory smile widening. Interesting reflex, he said softly. Where'd you learn that? Before Brennan could respond, Commander Hayes's voice cut across the hall. Lieutenant Voss, Castellanos, I need both of you for a final briefing. Now, they followed the commander to a small office off the main hall. Captain Moreno was already there, along with the base protocol officer. The briefing was quick and professional, covering last-minute timing adjustments and the order of recognition for outstanding performers. Brennan provided her updates on facility readiness, and Trent confirmed his officers were prepared for their ceremonial duties. As they filed out, Captain Moreno stopped Brennan with a gentle hand on her arm. "Castellanos, good work on the preparations. Everything looks outstanding." "Thank you, sir," Brennan replied, and something in her voice must have carried more weight than intended, because the captain studied her face for a long moment before nodding and letting her go. The final 3 hours before the ceremony passed in a blur of last-minute adjustments and confirmations. Brennan moved through her tasks with automatic precision, her mind partially disconnected from her body, a trick she'd learned years ago when functioning under extreme stress. You could compartmentalize, separate the part of you that felt from the part that performed, and keep moving forward until the mission was complete. At 1300 hours, word came through the radio net that Admiral Sutherland's motorcade had entered the base. The ceremony was officially in motion. Brennan took her position near the back of the hall, where she could monitor everything and respond to problems without being conspicuous. She watched as personnel filed in, taking their assigned seats, the hall filling with a quiet murmur of conversation. Trent and his officers stood near the front, ready to escort the Admiral when he arrived. Corinna had positioned herself in the third row, her phone out, clearly planning to record everything. The base photographer moved into position. The stage lights came up, and Brennan stood in the shadows, her hands clasped in front of her, her flag pin catching the light, her secrets hidden beneath sleeves and silence, and the carefully constructed walls she'd built around the truth of who she'd been and what she'd survived. The assembly hall fell silent as Admiral Sutherland entered through the east doors. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who'd spent 40 years in uniform, his dress whites immaculate, his 3 stars catching the light with each step. 2 aides flanked him, and behind them came a small security detail that positioned themselves discreetly near the exits. Everyone rose as he entered, the rustle of 500 people standing in unison, creating a wave of sound that rolled through the space. Brennan stood with the others, her posture automatic, her body remembering protocols her mind had tried to forget. The Admiral proceeded down the center aisle, acknowledging personnel with small nods, his weathered face carrying the kind of gravity that came from decades of command decisions and the weight of lives entrusted to his care. He took his position on stage, and Captain Moreno called the hall to attention with crisp formality. The ceremony began with the national anthem, and Brennan's hand moved to her heart, covering the flag pin on her lapel. She sang the words quietly, her voice lost among hundreds of others, but the familiar lyrics carried their own weight. She'd sung them in field hospitals with the sounds of helicopters overhead. She'd sung them at memorial services for people who died in her arms. The anthem meant something different when you'd seen what it cost to defend. The Admiral's opening remarks were brief and professional. He spoke about service and sacrifice, about the importance of every person's contribution to the mission, regardless of rank or position. He praised the base personnel for their operational excellence and their commitment to the Navy's core values. It was standard ceremony rhetoric, but delivered with the authenticity of someone who meant every word. Then came the recognition portion. Captain Moreno read names from a prepared list, and service members stepped forward to receive certificates and coins from the Admiral. Each recognition was accompanied by a brief description of the person's achievements. An operations specialist who'd improved supply chain efficiency by 30%. A maintenance chief who'd led a team through a complex repair that saved millions in equipment replacement costs. A junior officer who developed a new training protocol that was being adopted fleet-wide. Brennan watched from her position along the wall, genuine appreciation in her eyes for each person recognized. They were all doing important work, contributing to the mission in meaningful ways. This was what military service looked like in peacetime, in the daily grind of operations and logistics, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept the machine running smoothly. She was so focused on the ceremony that she almost missed Trent moving through the crowd toward her. He positioned himself nearby, close enough to speak without being overheard by most of the audience. Corinna followed, her phone held low but clearly recording. You know what's funny? Trent whispered, his voice barely audible under the captain's continued announcements. All these people getting recognized for their service, and you're standing here like you belong among them. Brennan kept her eyes forward, her expression neutral. She wouldn't let him bait her. Not here, not during an official ceremony with an admiral present. But Trent wasn't finished. I did some more digging last night. He continued, his tone conversational, but carrying an undercurrent of malice. Called some contacts and personnel. Ran your name through every database I could access. And you know what I found? Nothing. No service record. No deployment history. No unit assignments. It's almost like you never served at all. Corinna leaned in from the other side, her voice a poisonous whisper. Which makes that flag pin you're wearing a pretty bold statement. Makes everything about you a lie. Actually, on stage, the Admiral was recognizing a senior chief for 25 years of distinguished service. The hall erupted in applause, providing cover for the confrontation unfolding in the back corner. Brennan's hands tightened where they were clasped in front of her, her knuckles going white with the pressure. "Lieutenant Voss," she said quietly, her voice carrying a warning edge that Trent either didn't hear or chose to ignore. "This is not the time or place." "Oh, I think it's exactly the time and place," he replied. "All these real veterans in one room, and a fake standing among them. Someone should say something. Someone should point out that you don't belong here." The applause died down, and the ceremony continued. More names, more recognitions, more certificates and coins handed out with ceremonial precision. But Brennan was no longer fully present in the moment. Part of her awareness had shifted to threat assessment mode, calculating exits and responses, measuring the distance between herself and potential conflict, preparing for the moment when situations deteriorated beyond verbal confrontation. She'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. She'd spent 4 years building a quiet life, avoiding attention, keeping her past buried where it couldn't hurt anyone. But Trent had made her his mission, and Corinna had provided the ammunition, and now they stood on either side of her like predators who'd cornered prey and were savoring the moment before the kill. The ceremony was approaching its midpoint. The Admiral had recognized approximately half the personnel on his list, and the audience was settling into the comfortable rhythm of applause and acknowledgement. No one was paying attention to the back corner where Brennan stood with her tormentors closing in. "I'm going to give you one chance," Trent said, his voice hardening with authority he thought his rank provided. "Remove that pin. Walk out of this ceremony. Stop pretending to be something you're not." Brennan turned to face him then, really face him, and something in her eyes made him take an involuntary step back. For just a moment, the mask she wore slipped, and what showed through was something harder than he'd expected, something tempered by experiences he couldn't imagine. "You don't know what you're talking about, Lieutenant," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a weight that made the words feel like stones. "You don't know anything about me." "Then prove it," Corinna challenged, holding up her phone. "Prove you served. Right here, right now. Or admit you're a fraud." The applause swelled again as another recognition was completed. And in that moment of noise and distraction, Brennan made a decision. She could walk away, leave the ceremony, avoid the confrontation that was building like a storm front. Or she could stand her ground, consequences be damned. She chose to stand. Her hand moved unconsciously to her ribs, pressing against the fabric of her dress and the scars hidden beneath. She'd earned those scars. She'd earned the right to stand in this hall, among these people, wearing that small flag pin that represented everything she'd given and everything she'd lost. But she said nothing. She just stood there, her silence more powerful than any defense she could offer, and waited for whatever came next. The ceremony continued its measured progression across the stage, each recognition a carefully orchestrated moment of appreciation and acknowledgement. But in the back corner of the hall, the tension had reached a breaking point. Trent's patience, never substantial to begin with, had finally exhausted itself. "I'm not going to stand here and watch this," he said, his voice rising just enough to draw attention from the people seated nearby. Several heads turned, confusion crossing their faces as they tried to understand what was happening. Trent noticed the audience and seemed to feed off it. his posture straightening with renewed purpose. Corinna moved closer, her phone still recording, capturing everything. "This is going to be good," she whispered, barely containing her excitement. Finally, someone's going to call out the fraud. On stage, Captain Moreno was reading the next name on the recognition list, but his voice had taken on a questioning quality. He'd noticed the disturbance, the shifting attention of the audience, the way some people were looking toward the back of the hall instead of the stage. Even the Admiral had paused, his sharp eyes scanning the room for the source of disruption. Brennan felt the weight of attention beginning to shift in her direction, and every instinct screamed at her to leave, to walk out before this escalated further. But her feet wouldn't move. Something deeper than self-preservation had taken root, a stubborn refusal to run from people who had no idea what they were demanding she prove. Trent raised his voice, projecting now with the authority of his rank. "Excuse me, sir," he called out toward the stage. "Admiral Sutherland, sir. I apologize for the interruption, but there's a matter of integrity that needs to be addressed." The hall went silent. 500 people held their breath as the Admiral's attention locked onto Trent with the intensity of a targeting radar. The Admiral descended from the stage with measured steps, his aides following closely. Captain Moreno and Commander Hayes moved with him, their expressions tight with concern and growing anger. "This better be important, Lieutenant," Captain Moreno said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet fury that was far more dangerous than shouting. "You're interrupting an official ceremony." Trent stood his ground, emboldened by what he believed was righteousness. "Sir, it's about her," he said, gesturing toward Brennan. "She's been misrepresenting herself, wearing military symbols, implying service when there's no record of it. I've checked multiple databases, sir. She has no documented service history, no DD-214, no unit assignments. She's a fraud." The word hung in the air like smoke. Brennan felt every eye in the hall turn toward her, the weight of their collective attention pressing down like physical force. She stood perfectly still, her hands at her sides now, her face carefully composed even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The Admiral moved closer, studying her with those sharp eyes that had evaluated countless personnel over decades of command. He looked at the flag pin on her lapel, then at her face, then at the way she held herself with a stillness that spoke of iron control. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. "Brennan Castellanos, sir. I work in base operations." "And did you serve, Ms. Castellanos?" The question was simple, direct, but loaded with implications that rippled through the silent hall. Brennan met the Admiral's eyes, and for a moment she was back in the desert, back in the chaos, back in the moments when answers had to be given quickly and honestly because lives depended on truth. "Yes, sir," she said. "I served." "She's lying," Corinna interjected, holding up her phone like it was evidence in a trial. "There's no record. We've checked everything. She's stolen valor, clear as day." Commander Hayes stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. "Wade, you need to stop talking right now. And Lieutenant Voss, you are dangerously close to a formal reprimand for disrupting this ceremony." But Trent wasn't backing down. He'd committed fully now, invested too much in his crusade to retreat. "With respect, ma'am, this is about integrity, about protecting the meaning of service. She has no proof, no documentation, nothing that verifies her claims, and she refuses to provide any." The Admiral held up a hand, silencing everyone. His attention remained fixed on Brennan, and she could see him processing information, making calculations, reading the subtle signals that years of command experience had taught him to recognize. He saw something in her posture, in the way she stood, in the carefully controlled expression that suggested discipline learned under fire. "Ms. Castellanos," the Admiral said, his voice carrying across the now silent hall. "Personnel records can be complicated. Some service histories are classified or sealed for various reasons. Some deployments don't appear in standard databases. So I'm going to ask you directly, and I expect a direct answer. Did you deploy? Did you see combat?" Brennan's throat tightened. This was the moment she'd spent 4 years avoiding, the question she'd hoped never to answer in public. The truth she'd buried under civilian clothes and quiet competence, and the desperate hope that she could just be normal, just be safe, just be someone other than the person she'd been in the worst moments of her life. "Yes, sir," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I deployed. I saw combat." Trent laughed, harsh and disbelieving. "She's lying, Admiral. She has to be lying. There's no record, no proof, nothing. She's just a civilian employee who wants attention, who wants to feel special by pretending she's one of us." The Admiral's expression darkened, his patience with Trent clearly exhausted. "Lieutenant, you made your accusation. Now, unless you have actual evidence beyond absence in a database, I suggest you stand out." But Corinna wasn't finished. "Make her prove it," she demanded, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "If she really served, if she really deployed, she'll have scars. She'll have proof on her body. Make her show us." The suggestion hung in the air, obscene in its invasiveness, appalling in its cruelty. Commander Hayes looked like she wanted to physically remove Corinna from the hall. Captain Moreno's face had gone red with anger. And the Admiral, this three-star officer who'd commanded thousands of personnel and made life-and-death decisions for decades, looked at Corinna with something approaching disgust. "That is completely inappropriate," he said, his voice cold enough to freeze nitrogen. "No one is required to display physical injuries to prove their service to you or anyone else." But Brennan was no longer listening to the Admiral. She was looking at Trent, at Corinna, at the 500 people watching this spectacle unfold. She was thinking about 4 years of hiding, for years of silence, for years of carrying her truth like a weight she could never put down. And she was thinking about all the people who'd died, who'd sacrificed everything, who deserved to be remembered by something more than her quiet invisibility. Her hands moved to the buttons of her blazer. Brennan's fingers worked the buttons of her blazer with mechanical precision, each one sliding free with a small click that seemed impossibly loud in the silent hall. The Admiral's eyes widened slightly, understanding what was about to happen, but he didn't stop her. Commander Hayes took a half step forward, concern etched across her face, but she too remained still. The blazer came off, revealing the black dress beneath with its long sleeves and modest neckline. For a moment, nothing changed. Brennan stood there holding her blazer, her breathing controlled, her mind strangely calm now that the decision had been made. She'd spent 4 years protecting herself, hiding, maintaining the walls between who she'd been and who she'd tried to become. But walls could only stand so long under sustained assault. She handed the blazer to Commander Hayes, who took it wordlessly, her expression shifting from concern to something deeper, something that looked like dawning horror at what might come next. Brennan's hands moved to the cuffs of her dress sleeves. They were held closed by small pearl buttons, decorative and delicate, chosen because they'd seemed professional when she'd bought the dress. Her fingers trembled as she worked the first button free, then the second, the right sleeve, then the left. Each button releasing felt like opening a door she'd kept locked, revealing rooms she'd tried to forget existed. She began rolling up her right sleeve, slowly, deliberately, the fabric sliding up her forearm with a whisper of cloth against skin. The first marks became visible, burn scars, mottled and textured, running in irregular patterns from her wrist toward her elbow. Not small burns, not kitchen accidents or careless moments with hot pans. These were the kind of burns that came from exposure to intense heat, from proximity to explosions, for being too close to fire that consumed metal and flesh with equal indifference. The hall remained frozen, 500 people barely breathing. Trent's smug expression beginning to crack. Corinna's phone still recording, but her hand shaking now, uncertainty replacing her earlier confidence. Brennan continued rolling the sleeve higher, past her elbow, to her upper arm. More scars. Deeper ones. Places where skin had been grafted, where surgeons had done their best to reconstruct what fire and shrapnel had destroyed. The patterns were chaotic, violent, speaking of trauma that no amount of medical intervention could completely erase. She repeated the process with her left sleeve, revealing similar damage. Both arms marked by combat, by survival, by the price paid for keeping others alive in conditions that defied comprehension. The fluorescent lights of the assembly hall cast harsh shadows across the scarred tissue, making every ridge and valley of damaged skin visible to hundreds of witnesses. But she wasn't finished. Her hands moved to the hem of her dress, gripping the fabric at her right side. The Admiral understood what was coming, and his face went pale. Captain Moreno looked away, then forced himself to look back, to witness what he suspected would be worse than the arms. Brennan lifted the dress hem, slowly, revealing her right side from hip to ribcage. The scars here were different. Surgical scars, clean and precise, where doctors had cut her open to repair internal damage. But interspersed among the surgical marks were other scars, dozens of them, small and irregular. Shrapnel scars, entry wounds from fragments of metal that had torn through her body with the indiscriminate violence of explosions. She held the fabric there, her torso exposed from hip to just below her bra line, letting everyone see the evidence written in scar tissue across her skin. The mathematical reality of combat. The physical proof of survival measured in inches of damaged flesh. Then she lifted the left side, revealing even more extensive damage. A massive burn scar that covered most of her left flank, the kind of injury that spoke of prolonged exposure to fire. More shrapnel scars, more surgical scars. The entire left side of her torso was a battlefield map of trauma, each mark representing a moment when she should have died, but somehow didn't. The silence in the hall had become absolute. Not the silence of anticipation, but the silence of shock, of collective witnessing of something that transcended ceremony and hierarchy and all the petty concerns that had seemed important minutes before. This was the silence that came when people confronted the reality of what service sometimes cost, what sacrifice sometimes looked like when stripped of rhetoric and ceremony. Trent's face had gone white. His mouth opened and closed without sound. His earlier confidence evaporated like water on hot pavement. Corinna had lowered her phone, her expression stricken, her righteousness transformed into something that looked like horror at what she demanded to see. The Admiral moved closer, his eyes scanning the scars with the practiced assessment of someone who'd seen combat injuries before, who understood the language they spoke. His jaw tightened as he processed the pattern, the distribution, the severity. These weren't the kind of injuries you got from a single incident. These were the accumulated damage of sustained combat operations, of multiple engagements, of someone who'd been in the thick of it repeatedly and kept going back. Brennan let the dress fall back into place, but her arms remained exposed, sleeves rolled to her shoulders, the burn scars visible to everyone in the hall. She met the Admiral's eyes, and he saw something there that made his expression shift into recognition. When he asked quietly, "Where?" Brennan's voice was steady when she answered, clear enough to carry across the silent hall, even though she spoke barely above a normal volume. "Operation Enduring Freedom, sir. Afghanistan, 2019 through 2021. I was a Navy hospital corpsman assigned to a Marine unit. We were operating in Helmand Province during some of the heaviest fighting of the withdrawal operations." The Admiral's eyes closed briefly, and when they opened, they held a depth of understanding that came from knowing exactly what she'd experienced. "Helmand," he repeated. "That was hell. That was pure hell." "Yes, sir," Brennan said simply. "It was. What was your unit? What was your designation?" "Fleet Marine Force Corpsman, 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, sir. We called ourselves the Devil Dogs Medical Detachment. We ran casualty collection points under fire and conducted medical evacuations through hostile territory." The Admiral's hand moved unconsciously to his chest, pressing against his uniform, where his own ribbon spoke of past service and past operations. He'd lost Marines in Helmand. Everyone who'd commanded during that period had lost Marines. The withdrawal had been chaos, the fighting brutal, the casualties staggering. "How many did you treat?" he asked, and Brennan understood he was asking a different question. "How many did you save? How many did you lose? How many ghosts do you carry?" "Too many to count, sir," she answered honestly. We had days where the casualties came faster than we could process them. Days where the line between living and dying was measured in seconds, and the only thing that mattered was keeping people breathing long enough to get them to surgical teams. Her voice remained steady, but something in her eyes spoke of cost that couldn't be measured in scar tissue alone. The Admiral stood perfectly still, his 3 decades of command experience fighting against the emotion threatening to break through his professional composure. He knew Helmand Province. He knew what it meant to serve there during the withdrawal. He knew the kind of hell that turned human beings into the walking wounded, marked forever by experiences that civilians could never truly comprehend. 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, he repeated, his voice rough. I knew their commander. Good man. Lost him in 2020 to an IED strike during a medical evacuation convoy. Brennan's expression flickered, just for a moment, and the Admiral saw the pain behind her controlled facade. Yes, sir. Colonel Thaddeus Reinhardt. He died protecting our casualty collection point. Threw himself on the vehicle carrying our most critical wounded when the IED detonated. He saved 17 Marines that day. The Admiral nodded slowly, processing this confirmation of something he'd suspected. You were there. You were in that convoy. It wasn't a question, but Brennan answered anyway. Yes, sir. I was treating casualties in the lead vehicle when it happened. The explosion threw us 30 feet. My medical supplies caught fire. I was pinned under wreckage with 3 critical patients, and the fuel tank was leaking. We had maybe 2 minutes before the whole thing went up. She said it matter-of-factly, without drama or embellishment, but the words painted a picture that made several people in the audience draw sharp breaths. Commander Hayes had gone pale. Captain Moreno's hands were clenched at his sides, and Trent looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The Admiral's next question came quietly. The burns on your arms. The fire? Yes, sir. The medical supplies included oxygen tanks and chemical compounds that accelerated the fire. I had to pull the wounded through the flames to get them clear of the vehicle before it exploded. My sleeves caught fire. The synthetic fabric melted into my skin before I could extinguish it. How many did you get out? All 3, sir. 2 ambulatory wounded helped me, with the 3rd, who was unconscious. We got 20 feet away when the vehicle detonated. The shrapnel from the explosion. That's where these came from, she said, gesturing to her torso where the dress now covered the dozens of small scars. I took most of on my left side, shielding the unconscious Marine. Did he survive? Yes, sir. All 3 made it. 1 lost his legs, but he lived. He sent me Christmas cards with pictures of his kids. The Admiral's jaw worked silently for a moment, processing the implications of what she described. The kind of courage it took to pull wounded men through fire. The kind of commitment it took to use your own body as a shield. The kind of person who did those things and then spent 4 years working quietly in logistics, never mentioning any of it, wearing long sleeves to hide the proof. Why isn't any of this in the standard databases? He asked. Why no service record that Lieutenant Voss could find? Brennan glanced at Trent, who looked like he was about to be sick, then back to the Admiral. Some of our operations were classified, sir. The casualty collection points we ran were in areas officially designated as non-combat zones for political reasons. Our medical records were sealed under operational security protocols. My DD-214 exists, but it's in a restricted file that requires specific clearance to access. The Admiral turned to Captain Moreno. Captain, I want those records pulled and verified immediately. If they're classified, get them declassified. This woman's service record should be visible to anyone who needs to see it. Yes, sir, Captain Moreno replied, already pulling out his phone to make the calls. But the Admiral wasn't finished. He turned back to Brennan, and his voice softened in a way that made her defenses crack just slightly. How long were you in country? 2 years, sir. Extended deployment due to the operational tempo. We couldn't rotate medical personnel out because training replacements took too long, and we needed experienced corpsmen who could function in sustained combat conditions. 2 years in Helmand, the Admiral said, and several officers in the audience winced at the words. That's not a deployment. That's a war within a war. Brennan didn't respond, but her silence spoke volumes. The Admiral could see the weight she carried, the invisible burden that pressed down on her shoulders even now. Even here in the safety of a California naval base thousands of miles from the desert and the fire and the endless stream of broken bodies that had defined her service. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Commander Hayes asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why hide this? Why let people like Voss question your service when you could have shown them the truth?" Brennan looked at her, and for the first time since this confrontation began, her composure wavered. "Because this," she said, gesturing to her exposed arms, to the scars that told stories no one should have to carry. "This isn't who I want to be. I didn't want to be the wounded veteran, the person people look at with pity or treat differently, because they know what I've been through. I want to be normal. I wanted to just do my job and live a life that wasn't defined by the worst things I've ever experienced." The honesty of the statement hit like a physical force. Several people in the audience had tears in their eyes now. Commander Hayes wiped at her face discreetly. Even some of the junior officers looked shaken by the raw truth of what Brennan had revealed, not just about her service, but about the cost of trying to move past it. The Admiral stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Ms. Castellanos, you have every right to privacy about your service. Every right to choose how you present yourself and what you share about your past. But you also have the right to be recognized for what you did, for the lives you saved, for the sacrifices you made. Those rights exist simultaneously, and no one," he turned to look directly at Trent, "no one has the authority to question your service or demand proof of your sacrifice." Trent had shrunk into himself, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He looked young suddenly, exposed as someone who'd made terrible assumptions and compounded them with cruelty. Corinna stood beside him, her phone now lowered, her expression devastated by the reality of what she demanded to see. The Admiral's attention returned to Brennan. "I'm going to ask you something, and you have the right to refuse. But I think there are 500 people in this hall who would benefit from hearing the rest of your story. Will you tell us what happened after the convoy attack? Will you tell us why you left active duty?" Brennan's hands trembled as she reached for her blazer, which Commander Hayes immediately provided. She held it against her chest like armor, like protection, her scarred arms still exposed, but her posture defensive now. The question the Admiral asked required her to open doors she'd kept locked for 4 years, to speak words she'd never said aloud to anyone except the therapists at the VA hospital. But she looked at the faces watching her. Some curious, some compassionate, some still shocked by what they'd witnessed. She thought about the Marines she'd saved, the ones who sent Christmas cards, and the ones whose names were carved into memorial walls. She thought about Colonel Reinhardt throwing himself on that vehicle, sacrificing everything so his Marines could live. And she thought about silence, about hiding, about the cost of invisibility. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I'll tell you." Brennan pulled her blazer on slowly, covering her arms, but leaving the sleeves rolled up enough that the scars remained visible. It felt important somehow to keep that evidence in view while she spoke the words she'd spent 4 years avoiding. The Admiral gestured toward the stage, an invitation rather than an order, and she found herself walking forward through the silent hall, 500 pairs of eyes tracking her every step. She climbed the 3 stairs to the stage, her heels clicking against the wood with sharp precision. The microphone stood at center stage, positioned for the ceremony that had been interrupted by accusations and transformed into something else entirely. She gripped the sides of the podium, her scarred hands visible to everyone in the front rows, and took a breath that felt like diving underwater. The convoy attack happened in July 2020. She began, her voice amplified through the hall's sound system. "We've been operating at maximum capacity for 3 months straight, running medical evacuations around the clock during the withdrawal operations. The Taliban knew we were pulling out, and they were pushing hard, trying to inflict maximum casualties before we left. Every day brought more wounded. Every night brought more fighting." She paused, her eyes focused somewhere past the audience, seeing something that existed only in memory. That morning, we'd received word of a major engagement 15 miles from our position. Multiple casualties, including several critical. My team loaded into 3 vehicles with full medical equipment and enough supplies to establish a temporary surgical unit if needed. Colonel Reinhardt insisted on leading the convoy personally because the route was considered high risk. The Admiral listened with absolute focus, his expression revealing nothing but his posture radiating attention. Others in the audience leaned forward, drawn into the narrative despite its darkness. We made it to the engagement site and began treating casualties immediately, Brennan continued. 32 wounded Marines, 7 critical, meaning they had maybe an hour to live without surgical intervention. We stabilized them as best we could under fire, loaded them into our vehicles, and started the return journey. I was in the lead vehicle with 3 of the critical cases. Colonel Reinhardt was in the second vehicle, coordinating our route and security. Her hands tightened on the podium. The IED was buried deep, sophisticated construction, probably command detonated because it triggered exactly when our lead vehicle passed over it. The explosion was massive. Our vehicle flipped, caught fire immediately. I was pinned between equipment and the vehicle wall with 3 Marines who were already critical before the blast made everything worse. She could see it so clearly. The smoke, the flames, the screaming, the desperate calculations of triage in impossible conditions. One of the Marines was unconscious, catastrophic internal injuries from the original firefight. The second had lost an arm and was going into shock. The third was barely hanging on with chest trauma that made every breath a struggle. The fire spread fast, she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of remembered urgency. Medical oxygen tanks were leaking, feeding the flames. I had maybe 90 seconds to get everyone out before the fuel tank exploded. But I was pinned, and the casualties couldn't move on their own. I had to free myself first, which meant pushing through wreckage that was already burning. She held up her arms, showing the burn scars. This happened while I was fighting to get free. The synthetic fabric of my uniform melted into my skin. I couldn't stop to extinguish the flames because time was everything. Once I was free, I pulled the first Marine out, the one with the arm amputation, dragged him through the flames and 20 feet from the vehicle. Went back for the second Marine, the one with chest trauma. Got him clear. The third Marine, the unconscious one, he was trapped under equipment that had collapsed when the vehicle flipped. The audience was absolutely silent, hanging on every word. Even Trent had tears streaming down his face, his earlier cruelty transformed into devastated comprehension. I went back a third time, Brennan said. The fire was everywhere by then, heat so intense it felt like being inside an oven. I found a Marine, started pulling equipment off him, and that's when the fuel tank caught. The explosion threw me clear, but the shrapnel from the vehicle tore through my left side. I was told later that I took most of the blast force, that my body shielded the Marine I was trying to save. Did he make it? Someone in the audience called out, unable to contain the question. Brennan's expression softened slightly. Yes, all 3 made it to surgical teams alive. All 3 survived their injuries and eventually made it home. The one I shielded from the explosion, his name is Lance Corporal Devin Ashby. He's working as a teacher in Montana now. We exchange emails sometimes. He has 2 daughters and coaches youth basketball. The Admiral spoke quietly. And Colonel Reinhardt? Brennan's composure cracked, just for a moment. When the IED hit our vehicle, Colonel Reinhardt ordered his vehicle to move forward to position between us and potential follow-up attacks. He was coordinating air support and additional medical evacuation when a second IED detonated directly beneath his vehicle. He was killed instantly along with his driver and gunner. They died protecting us while we pulled casualties from the burning wreckage. She stopped, gathering herself, forcing the emotion back down where it belonged. The silence in the hall had weight now, heavy with understanding and grief for people most had never known, but whose sacrifice had become real through Brennan's words. I spent 6 weeks recovering from my injuries, she continued. Multiple surgeries to remove shrapnel, skin grafts for the burns, physical therapy to regain full mobility. The medical teams did incredible work, but the physical injuries weren't the hard part. The hard part was that 3 days after I was cleared to return to duty, we had another mass casualty event. 47 wounded Marines in a single engagement. I treated them all, processed them all, saved most of them, and I realized I had nothing left. Her voice dropped lower, more intimate. I've been running on adrenaline and duty and the knowledge that people needed me for 2 years. But there's a limit to what anyone can sustain. I was having flashbacks during triage, seeing Colonel Reinhardt's face on every casualty, smelling burning fuel every time we loaded wounded into vehicles. I was still functional, still doing my job, but I knew I was breaking. So I requested separation from active duty once my tour ended. Not because I didn't believe in the mission, not because I didn't care about the Marines I served with, but because I had nothing left to give without destroying myself completely. The Admiral nodded slowly, understanding written across his weathered face. That's not weakness, he said clearly, his voice carrying through the silent hall. That's recognizing your limits after pushing past them for 2 years. That's having the courage to survive when survival requires walking away. Brennan met his eyes, and something in his words seemed to lift a weight she'd carried for too long. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. "When you left active duty, what happened to your records?" The Admiral asked. "Why the secrecy?" "The operations we ran were classified because officially we weren't supposed to be in some of the areas where casualties occurred," Brennan explained. Political considerations, rules of engagement limitations, the complicated reality of withdrawal operations that didn't want to acknowledge ongoing combat intensity. My medical treatment records and casualty reports were sealed under operational security protocols. My DD-214 exists, but accessing it requires security clearance and knowledge of the classification system. Most standard database searches won't find it. The Admiral turned to face the audience, his voice taking on the command presence of someone delivering orders. "Let me be absolutely clear about something. This woman saved lives under conditions that would break most people. She demonstrated courage, skill, and dedication that exemplifies everything we claim to value about military service. And then she chose to live quietly, to work in logistics, to contribute without demanding recognition or special treatment. That's the kind of integrity we should aspire to, not question." The Admiral turned back to Brennan, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, perhaps, or the kind of respect that came from shared understanding of what combat truly cost. He reached into his uniform pocket and withdrew something that glinted in the stage lights. A coin, but not just any coin. His personal challenge coin, reserved for moments of exceptional recognition. He stepped forward and placed it in her scarred hand, his fingers closing over hers for just a moment. "What you did in Helmand, what you survived, what you chose to do afterward by serving quietly without demanding recognition, that represents the very best of what it means to serve," he said, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "I'm honored to have the opportunity to acknowledge it, even if the circumstances that led to this moment were regrettable." Brennan looked down at the coin in her palm, the weight of it somehow heavier than its physical mass. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice thick with emotion she could no longer fully contain. The Admiral turned to address the full audience, his command presence filling the space. "I want everyone here to understand something. Ms. Castellanos has spent 4 years working in logistics on this base, doing her job with excellence and dedication, never asking for special treatment or recognition. She wore long sleeves every day to hide scars that tell a story of heroism most of us can't comprehend. She endured mockery and accusations of stolen valor rather than revealed trauma she had every right to keep private. That kind of strength, that kind of dignity deserves our profound respect." He paused, letting his words settle over the crowd. And to Lieutenant Voss and Ms. Wade, he continued, his tone hardening, "Your behavior today was reprehensible. You demanded proof of service from someone who had every right to privacy. You accused a genuine hero of fraud without evidence. You disrupted an official ceremony to pursue a personal vendetta based on your own assumptions and prejudices. There will be consequences for your actions, and those consequences will be severe." Trent stood frozen in the audience, tears still streaming down his face, his earlier arrogance completely shattered. Corinna had gone pale, her phone clutched uselessly in her hand, the recording that was supposed to expose a fraud instead capturing her own cruelty on display. Captain Moreno stepped forward, his voice official and cold. "Lieutenant Voss, you are relieved of your current duties pending a formal investigation into your conduct. Ms. Wade, your contract with this base is terminated effective immediately. Both of you will report to my office after the ceremony concludes to receive formal reprimand documentation." The weight of their punishment hung in the air, but Brennan felt no satisfaction in it. She'd never wanted this confrontation, never wanted to expose them or seek revenge. She just wanted to do her job in peace, to live a quiet life that wasn't defined by her worst memories. But they'd forced her hand, and now everyone would pay a price for it. Commander Hayes approached the stage, her expression a mixture of admiration and regret. "Brennan, I owe you an apology," she said clearly, her voice amplified enough for the audience to hear. "As your supervisor, I should have done more to protect you from harassment. I should have intervened earlier, before things reached this point. I failed in my duty of care, and I'm sorry." Brennan shook her head slightly. "You didn't know, Commander. No one knew. That was my choice. But it shouldn't have mattered whether we knew," Hayes insisted. "Your work, your professionalism, your contributions to this base, those should have been enough. You shouldn't have had to prove your worth through displaying trauma. That's on all of us who allowed the harassment to continue." The audience began to stir, murmurs of agreement rippling through the crowd. Several officers stood, and then more, and suddenly the entire hall was rising in a standing ovation that started as scattered applause and grew into sustained recognition. 500 people on their feet, clapping not just for Brennan's revealed service, but for her years of quiet dignity, her daily contributions, her choice to survive by moving forward rather than staying trapped in the past. Brennan stood on the stage, overwhelmed by the response, her scarred hands gripping the Admiral's coin like a lifeline. She'd spent 4 years trying to be invisible, and now she was the center of attention in the most public way possible. It was terrifying and validating in equal measure, forcing her to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, she deserved recognition even if she'd never sought it. The applause continued for nearly a minute before the Admiral raised his hand, bringing the hall back to order. The ceremony resumed, but everything had changed. The remaining recognitions were conducted with a new gravity, a deeper understanding of what service meant and what it cost. When each person stepped forward to receive their certificate or coin, they glanced at Brennan standing at the side of the stage, and their expressions carried new respect, new comprehension. After the final recognition, the Admiral made closing remarks that addressed the day's events directly. "Today, we witnessed something I never expected to see at a routine ceremony," he said. "We saw courage of a different kind. The courage to be vulnerable, to reveal pain that was easier to hide, to stand firm in the face of unjust accusations. We also saw the cost of assumptions, the danger of judging people based on incomplete information, and the profound harm that can come from demanding proof of sacrifice from those who've already given more than we have the right to ask." He looked directly at Brennan. "Ms. Castellanos, I'm going to make sure your service record is properly documented and accessible. I'm also going to recommend you for recognition that better reflects what you accomplished in Helmand Province. You saved lives at tremendous personal cost, and that deserves formal acknowledgement." Brennan wanted to protest, to say that she didn't need medals or official recognition, that she'd made peace with serving quietly. But something in the Admiral's expression told her that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every veteran who struggled to reintegrate, every person who chose privacy over publicity, every survivor who carried invisible wounds alongside visible scars. Her story had become larger than her own experience, and accepting recognition was part of honoring everyone who served in similar silence. "Yes, sir," she said. "Thank you, sir." The ceremony concluded with the national anthem, and Brennan sang the words with 500 other voices, her hand over the flag pin that had started this entire confrontation. The pin that Corinna had mocked, that Trent had questioned, that it seemed like such a small thing until it became the catalyst for everything that followed. As people began filing out of the hall, many approached Brennan directly. Junior officers offering respectful salutes. Enlisted personnel thanking her for her service. Civilian contractors apologizing for not speaking up sooner when they'd witnessed the harassment. The line stretched on, each person wanting a moment to acknowledge what they'd learned, what they'd witnessed, what had changed in their understanding. Commander Hayes stayed close, running interference when needed, ensuring Brennan wasn't overwhelmed by the attention. Captain Moreno coordinated with the Admiral's aides about follow-up actions and documentation requirements. And through it all, Brennan stood in her rolled-up sleeves, her scars visible, her truth finally in the open, feeling simultaneously exposed and liberated in ways she couldn't fully process. 3 weeks later, Brennan sat at her desk in the operations office, her sleeves rolled to her elbows as she worked through supply requisitions. The long sleeves were still in her closet at home, still an option if she wanted them, but she found herself choosing short sleeves more often now. Not because she wanted to display her scars, but because hiding them had started to feel like carrying extra weight she no longer needed to bear. The office dynamics had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. People greeted her by name in the hallways. Junior officers stopped by her desk to ask logistics questions with genuine respect in their voices. The base command had issued new directives about harassment and the importance of respecting privacy regarding service history. Commander Hayes had personally overseen mandatory training for all personnel about creating inclusive work environments for veterans transitioning to civilian roles. Trent Voss had been reassigned to a desk job at a different installation, his promising career trajectory permanently altered by his actions at the ceremony. Corinna Wade's contract had been terminated as promised, and word had spread quickly through the contractor community about what she'd done. Her professional reputation was effectively destroyed, a consequence of her own choices and cruelty. But Brennan found she couldn't take satisfaction in their downfall. What had happened at the ceremony wasn't about revenge or vindication. It was about truth, about the cost of assumptions, about the invisible burdens people carried, and the importance of treating everyone with basic human dignity regardless of what you thought you knew about them. Lieutenant Pruitt appeared at her office door, carrying a folder. "Castellanos, got a minute?" His tone was respectful, almost deferential, a marked change from the casual dismissiveness that had characterized most officer interactions before the ceremony. "Of course," Brennan replied, gesturing to the chair across from her desk. Pruitt sat down, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble. "I was there for a lot of Voss's comments about you. I didn't participate, but I didn't stop him either. I told myself it wasn't my business, that I shouldn't get involved. But silence is complicity, and I should have said something. Should have done something. I'm sorry." Brennan studied him for a moment, seeing genuine remorse in his expression. "Thank you for saying that, Lieutenant. It takes courage to acknowledge when we could have done better." Pruitt nodded, clearly relieved by her response. "I also wanted to ask if you'd be willing to speak to some of our junior personnel about transition challenges. A lot of them are approaching the end of their enlistments, trying to figure out what comes next. Hearing from someone who's successfully navigated that transition, who understands the complexities, I think it would be valuable." Brennan considered the request carefully. The idea of speaking publicly about her experiences still felt uncomfortable, exposing in ways she wasn't sure she was ready for. But she thought about all the veterans who struggled in silence, who hid their service because they wanted to be seen as normal, who carried invisible wounds while trying to build civilian lives. Maybe her story could help someone else navigate that difficult path. "I'll think about it," she said. "Give me some time to consider how I could contribute in a meaningful way." "That's fair," Pruitt said, standing to leave. "Thank you for considering it. And again, I'm sorry. For all of it." After he left, Brennan returned to her work, but her mind wandered to the changes that had rippled through her life since the ceremony. The Admiral had been true to his word. Her service records had been declassified and properly documented in accessible databases. She'd been formally recommended for the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for her actions during the convoy attack, with the approval process already underway. The recognition felt strange, validating, but also uncomfortable in its formality. More significantly, she'd started seeing a new therapist who specialized in combat trauma and post-military transition. For 4 years, she'd tried to manage her PTSD through sheer willpower and avoidance. But the ceremony had cracked something open inside her. The nightmares had intensified temporarily, but working through them with professional help was proving more effective than simply trying to bury them. Healing, she was learning, wasn't about forgetting or hiding. It was about integrating her experiences into a complete picture of who she was, scars and strength both acknowledged as part of her story. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. She opened it to find a message from Lance Corporal Devin Ashby, the Marine she'd shielded during the explosion. He'd somehow heard about what happened at the ceremony, probably through the military grapevine that connected veterans across distances and years. The email was brief but powerful. Doc Castellanos, heard you finally told your story. About damn time. You saved my life, and you never asked for anything in return except that I live it well. I'm trying every day to honor that gift. My daughters know your name. They know what you did. You're a hero whether you wanted to be one or not. Semper Fi. Devin. Brennan read the message 3 times, tears blurring her vision. She'd never thought of herself as a hero, just someone doing her job under impossible circumstances. But maybe that's what heroism actually was. Not seeking glory or recognition, but doing what needed to be done when it needed to be done, regardless of the cost. The afternoon passed in steady work, the comfortable rhythm of logistics coordination that had become her professional identity. As the day ended and personnel began filtering out of the building, Commander Hayes stopped by Brennan's desk. Heading out? Hayes asked. In a few minutes, Brennan replied. Just finishing some requisition approvals. Hayes hesitated, then spoke. I've been thinking about what you said at the ceremony, about wanting to be normal, to not be defined by your worst experiences. I understand that impulse, but I've also been thinking that maybe normal is overrated. Maybe what matters is being whole, being authentic, being willing to let people see all the parts of who we are, including the parts that are hard or painful or complicated. Brennan looked up from her computer, considering the words. That's easier said than done, Commander. Of course it is, Hayes agreed. Everything worthwhile usually is. But I'm watching you navigate this transition from enforced invisibility to acknowledged veteran, and I think you're finding a balance. You're not hiding anymore, but you're also not letting your service become your entire identity. That's powerful. That's the kind of example other people need to see. Brennan smiled slightly. Are you recruiting me for Lieutenant Pruitt's speaking engagement? Hayes laughed. Maybe. But more than that, I'm just acknowledging growth. Yours and mine, and this whole base's understanding of what it means to support veterans in our workforce. What happened at that ceremony was painful, but it catalyzed necessary change. After Hayes left, Brennan gathered her things and walked out to the parking lot. The San Diego evening was perfect, golden light slanting across the base, palm trees swaying in the coastal breeze. She unlocked her car, but paused before getting in, looking back at Building 47 where she'd worked quietly for 2 years, hiding her truth and trying to be invisible. She wasn't invisible anymore. Her story was out, her scars were visible, her service was documented. And surprisingly, the exposure didn't feel as terrifying as she'd feared. It felt like breathing after holding her breath for years. It felt like standing upright after carrying a weight that had slowly bent her spine. It felt like the beginning of something new, built on the foundation of everything she'd survived. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part or moment, or tell us if you've known someone who showed similar hidden courage. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these important stories. Brennan drove home as the sun set over the Pacific, the Admiral's Challenge coin sitting on her passenger's seat, catching the fading light. She thought about Colonel Reinhardt, about the Marines she'd saved, about the ones she'd lost, about the price of service and the cost of survival. She thought about Trent and Corinna and the consequences of their cruelty. She thought about forgiveness and healing and the long road ahead. But mostly, she thought about tomorrow, about returning to work with her sleeves rolled up and her head held high, about the veterans she might help by sharing her story, about the possibility of building a life that honored both who she'd been and who she was becoming. The scars would always be there, written in her skin, telling stories of fire and blood and sacrifice. But they didn't have to define her. They were part of her history, proof of her survival, evidence of her strength. And maybe, just maybe, they could become something more than reminders of trauma. They could become testaments to resilience, to the power of truth, to the importance of dignity in the face of those who would demand you prove your worth. Brennan Castellanos had survived Hellman Province. She'd survived the fire and the explosions and the endless stream of broken bodies. And now, she was learning to survive something equally challenging. The aftermath, the return to normal life, the integration of past and present into something whole. She was learning to survive peace. And that, in its own way, required as much courage as anything she'd faced in the desert.